The flight attendant placed a napkin on my tray. Her hands were shaking. Written in rushed ink were the words, "Pretend you are sick. Get off this plane right now." I looked up at her in disbelief. Her eyes were filled with panic. Not irritation, not confusion, pure fear. She leaned closer and whispered, "Please, I'm begging you." At that moment, I didn't know if this was a prank, a mistake, or something far more serious. But what happened 2 hours later proved one thing. Her warning wasn't just real. It was the reason I'm still alive today. Before we go further, make sure you subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. This story could happen to anyone. My name is Isla Warren. I'm a 30-year-old travel nurse who has seen enough human suffering to last a lifetime. I've held the hands of patients taking their last breaths. I've comforted families in hospital corridors. After months of non-stop work, I decided to take a short break and surprise my mother in Boston. She had just recovered from heart surgery, and she kept saying my voice helped her heal faster. I couldn't wait to see her face when I showed up unannounced. It was a normal afternoon at LAX airport. People were laughing. Children were pressing their faces against the terminal windows, watching planes taxi, and business travelers were tapping away on laptops. I felt tired, but peaceful. I whispered a quick prayer of gratitude that life was finally starting to feel stable again. As I boarded the flight, I noticed the flight attendants greeting passengers with rehearsed smiles. But one of them, her name tag read Alyssa, was different. She wasn't just polite. She was observing. Her eyes scanned each person boarding like she was memorizing faces. When our eyes met, she hesitated for half a second, almost like she recognized me, then quickly looked away. My seat was near the middle of the plane, aisle seat. Across from me sat a man in a black jacket who kept shifting nervously. He opened the overhead compartment twice even though he wasn't putting anything inside. Beside him, a quiet teenager hugged a backpack to his chest. Nothing seemed off, but the atmosphere wasn't the usual pre-flight chatter. There was tension, subtle, like a quiet storm building beneath clear skies. I texted my sister Chloe, boarded the flight. "Mom has no idea I'm coming. Get ready to film her reaction." She responded with heart emojis and reminders to bring her the special cookies from the airport bakery. Everything felt normal enough when I buckled in and adjusted my seatbelt. But then I noticed Alyssa again. She moved down the aisle slowly, pretending to check overhead bins, but her eyes were not on the luggage. They were on people. She looked terrified of someone, but I couldn't tell who. As she reached my row, she leaned down as if placing a napkin on my tray. She never made eye contact, never changed expression. And then she kept walking. I unfolded the napkin. "You are not safe. Pretend you are sick. Get off this plane immediately." My mind went blank. For a second, I thought it was a prank. Maybe someone was filming reactions for a social experiment. Maybe this was some kind of mistake. But when I looked back at Alyssa, she had stopped at the end of the aisle. She turned slowly and locked eyes with me. There was no humor in her face, no confusion, only urgency. My pulse began to race. I glanced around to see if anyone else had gotten a napkin. Everyone seemed calm. No one else appeared alarmed. Something was happening, and I was the only passenger being warned. I didn't know what to believe, but one thing was certain. I couldn't ignore the look in her eyes. If you want to know what happened when I stayed seated, and why this flight changed every part of my life, stay with me. And don't forget to subscribe and comment your country or city below. This is a story the world needs to hear. The napkin lay in my lap like a ticking bomb, each word echoing in my mind. You are not safe. Pretend you are sick. Get off this plane immediately. My instincts screamed at me to do something, but logic held me frozen in place. I glanced subtly toward Alyssa, the flight attendant, who stood near the galley with her back straight and her eyes fixed not on me, but on two passengers seated 3 rows ahead. Her posture wasn't casual. It was guarded, like she was preparing for something to happen. I tried convincing myself I was overreacting. Maybe she slipped the note to the wrong person. Maybe it wasn't even meant for me. But then she turned again, and for a split second, her eyes flicked to mine, and I saw something that shattered every excuse forming in my thoughts. Raw fear. That wasn't the face of someone playing a prank. That was the face of someone trying to save a life. I looked around the cabin to detect anything unusual. A man in a gray hoodie sat rigidly in a window seat, his hands gripping the edge of the armrests like he was bracing for impact. Across the aisle, a woman in a business suit kept tapping her foot rapidly, glancing at the front of the plane instead of settling into her book. But what made my skin prickle was the man in the black jacket near the emergency exit. He wasn't nervous. He was too calm, focused. His gaze kept drifting toward the cockpit door and then to Alyssa, as if waiting for a signal. I shifted in my seat and tried to steady my breathing. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe someone on board had a medical emergency or a mental breakdown. Maybe. And then I noticed something that made my heart drop. The overhead bins above the first-class cabin had been sealed shut with yellow zip ties, something I had seen only once, during a training video about in-flight security risks. My background as a nurse taught me to read situations quickly. Something wasn't right here. Something was being contained, monitored, controlled. Before I could process it, Alyssa suddenly stepped toward me, pretending to check my seatbelt. She leaned in, her voice barely audible. "Do it now. Say you feel faint. If you stay on this flight, you will not land alive." I wanted to speak, to ask questions, but her expression stopped me. It wasn't fear for herself. It was fear for me. She straightened, smiled mechanically, and continued down the aisle. My body tingled with adrenaline. I slowly reached for the call button to signal that I needed help, but before I pressed it, I hesitated. If this was real, what if drawing attention to myself made things worse? What if pretending to be sick triggered whatever danger she was warning me about? My fingers brushed the button when a loud noise thudded from the back of the plane, like someone had dropped something heavy. Instantly, heads turned. A male flight attendant rushed toward the noise, and I caught a glimpse of his face, white as a sheet. Behind him, the teenage boy who had been clutching his backpack was breathing rapidly into his hands, his eyes darting in panic. But his panic didn't look like fear of flying. It looked like fear of discovery. He kept whispering under his breath, "I can't do this. I can't do this," as if someone had forced him onto the plane against his will. Suddenly, the plane's engines changed pitch as it began taxiing faster toward the runway. My heart pounded. This was it. Once the plane was in the air, any chance to safely intervene would vanish. I looked out the window at the terminal we were leaving behind and realized, with bone-deep certainty, that I was about to make the most important decision of my life. Then my phone vibrated in my hand with a text from my sister. "Send me a pic from the plane. I want to post it before Mom sees you." A moment of heartbreak hit me. She had no idea. No one did. I typed back quickly, "Something's wrong. Pray for me." My finger hovered. Then I hit send. As the plane turned toward the runway, I suddenly felt a wave of dizziness, not pretend but real, brought on by sheer fear. My vision blurred, and I realized that doing nothing was the most dangerous option of all. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stood up shakily. A few passengers turned to look at me with irritation, assuming I was causing a delay. But I didn't care. As I stepped into the aisle, the man in the black jacket turned his head slowly toward me. His eyes were cold, assessing, like a predator noticing unexpected movement from prey. In that exact moment, Alyssa appeared beside me, placing a steadying hand on my arm, not to stop me, but to lead me. Her voice was calm, but her words were chilling. "Follow me if you want to live." Alyssa kept her hand firmly on my arm as though she were assisting a sick passenger, but the grip was too intentional to be purely supportive. The eyes of the man in the black jacket flickered with suspicion as he slowly stood from his seat, pretending to stretch. Every sense in my body went on high alert. Alyssa guided me toward the front of the plane, her voice loud enough for others to hear. "Ma'am, take deep breaths. We are going to get you some water." But just as we reached the galley, she leaned in and whispered in a low, urgent tone, "Do not look back. Someone is watching you. Your seat was not assigned by accident." My chest tightened as she sat me in the jump seat near the exit door. The male flight attendant moved beside her, pretending to fetch oxygen. Alyssa's lips barely moved as she continued. The person targeting this seat believes you are someone else. If you stay on this flight or return to your seat, they will act during cruising altitude. My thoughts raced. How could my seat be targeted? Was this a case of mistaken identity? And if I was sitting in a seat meant for someone else, who was that seat meant for? Alyssa reached into a compartment and subtly slid a small device toward her colleague. A silent signal passed between them. The colleague nodded and stepped away quickly. As the plane continued taxiing, I saw Alyssa's professional calm begin to crack. Her breathing quickened slightly as she made a call to the cockpit, requesting emergency return to gate due to medical escalation. The captain's voice responded with hesitation, asking for confirmation, and that's when I saw it. Alyssa looked over my shoulder past the curtain and locked eyes with someone. The expression on her face hardened. The captain then announced we were experiencing a short delay and would be returning to the gate. The atmosphere changed instantly. Passengers began murmuring in irritation, groaning loudly. But beneath the surface noise, I sensed something deeper, panic from certain individuals whose plans were being disrupted. The man in the black jacket stood fully now, his calm demeanor gone. He glanced toward the cockpit door, then at me, then toward the overhead bins, like he was calculating every angle. Behind him, the quiet teenage boy clutched his backpack even tighter, his lips moving rapidly as if he were praying. The woman in the business suit pulled out her phone and started texting furiously, her hands trembling. Alyssa positioned herself between me and the aisle, blocking their line of sight, as if she knew any sudden movement toward the exit could trigger chaos. "You need to choose right now," she whispered, while keeping a professional smile for appearances. "If you get off this plane, your life will be turned upside down. But if you stay, you will not get another chance to leave alive." My heart slammed against my ribs. I thought of my mother waiting in Boston, thinking I was just hours away. I thought of my sister, probably laughing in her dorm room, editing a funny video about surprising Mom. Then I thought of the fact that if Alyssa was right, my family would never see me again. The plane was now turning back toward the terminal, but we were still moving. If the threat was desperate, they might act before we even reached the gate. Alyssa unbuckled and moved to the intercom. Her voice remained professional, but I caught the slight tremor in it as she said, "Flight attendants, prepare doors for arrival." The engines slowed. The runway lights reflected off the windows. Suddenly, the teenage boy stood abruptly, his face pale. "I need to get off this plane, please," he said loudly. His voice cracked with real terror. A ripple of confusion ran through the cabin. It was clear now. I wasn't the only one who had been warned or threatened. Before anyone could react further, the man in the black jacket reached into his carry-on with a deliberate motion. Alyssa immediately stepped forward, raising her hand sharply. "Sir, please take your seat," she commanded. But he froze mid-motion when he noticed the cockpit door opening and two uniformed air marshals stepping quietly into the aisle from first class. It was then that I realized this entire situation was far more complex than one crew member acting alone. There was already an active federal operation in place, and somehow I had been placed right in the center of it. As the air marshals moved down the aisle, disguised as regular passengers until that moment, Alyssa looked back at me and said softly but firmly, "You were never the target, but now you are the key." My breath caught. Every nerve in my body told me this moment, right here, was the dividing line between my old life and whatever was coming next. I nodded once. "I want to get off this plane," I said out loud, my voice steady even though my hands were trembling. That sentence was my decision. Alyssa exhaled, as if she had been holding her breath. She stepped aside, signaling to the air marshal. The plane hadn't even stopped moving before the marshals secured the aisle and prepared for immediate evacuation. I had made my choice, and there was no going back. The plane had barely come to a full stop when everything erupted at once. The seatbelt signs were still on, but two federal air marshals were already moving down the aisle with controlled urgency. Passengers hadn't been told the real reason for our return, so confusion spread in murmurs that quickly turned into alarm as one of the marshals reached the row where the man in the black jacket sat. Instead of complying, the man stood up slowly, his expression unfazed, almost bored. His cold eyes darted first to me, then to the cockpit, then back to the marshal approaching him. In that instant, his hand slipped into his jacket. Before he could pull anything out, the marshal shouted a command, and the man froze, realizing he had been outmaneuvered. But that was just the first trigger. A second man, seated near the emergency exit, suddenly lunged toward the door lever. The entire cabin gasped. A flight attendant leaped forward to block him, but he shoved her back with surprising force. The teenage boy in the back screamed, "Don't open it. It's not what you think." His voice wasn't scared. It was devastated, like he knew something horrifying was about to happen. Passengers began panicking, some ducking down, others shouting. Children cried. The woman in the business suit who had been nervously texting stood and tried to push past people, only to be restrained by a second marshal. She yelled, "You don't understand! It's about to activate!" Her face had drained of all color. The words sent a jolt of cold electricity through me. Activate? What was about to activate? I looked to Alyssa, who was already pressing urgently into the intercom, her voice firm. "Remain in your seats. Do not touch any overhead compartments." Her calm tone didn't match the fear in her eyes. She stepped into the aisle and nodded to one of the marshals, who then reached up and pulled down a specific overhead bin, the one right above where I had originally been assigned to sit. Inside was not a bag. It was a sealed, wired device the size of a lunchbox, with a small blinking indicator light. The cabin went silent. People stared in disbelief. The man in the black jacket smirked, not in victory, but in satisfaction that we had finally seen the truth. He had expected this moment. Agents moved with rapid precision. One secured the man, zip-tying his hands behind his back as he stared straight ahead, like he had already accepted his fate. The other agent used a scanner on the device, but didn't touch it. Alyssa stepped closer, never taking her eyes off the criminals, while the teenage boy continued repeating, "It wasn't supposed to be here today. They switched the flight. They switched the target." His voice trembled with guilt. He wasn't an accomplice. He was a witness, or worse, someone being forced into involvement. The cockpit door swung open, and the captain emerged, face pale. He looked directly at Alyssa. "Is it live?" he asked. She nodded grimly. The tension in the air was suffocating. Alyssa then turned to me with a look that made my heart drop. "That device was placed under seat 14C, your seat." My breath caught. I had been assigned 14C only that morning after I changed my booking to an earlier flight to surprise my mother. My seat change had not been random. It had been intercepted. If I hadn't gotten that napkin, if I had stayed seated, if Alyssa hadn't noticed the switch, I wouldn't have made it off that plane alive. But the nightmare didn't end there. As law enforcement began evacuating passengers row by row, the woman in the business suit continued yelling to anyone who would listen. "It's remote triggered. There's someone on the ground." Those words ignited a new wave of terror. The marshals mobilized immediately, alerting ground control. Emergency response units surrounded the plane. Everyone was being rushed out through the rear door farthest from the device. When my turn came, Alyssa placed a steady hand on my shoulder. Her voice was low and calm. "It was never about you. They thought a federal informant would be sitting in your seat, someone with sensitive documents. They targeted Flight 14 for a political assassination. You boarded in their place without knowing." As we stepped onto the jet bridge, I saw 3 men in tactical gear sprinting down the corridor toward the terminal. Something was still happening. I heard shouting from the gate area. People were running. The teenage boy, now in protective custody, looked back at me with tears in his eyes and said, more to himself than anyone, "They said no one would know. They said no one would get hurt except the target." It became clear. This wasn't random violence. It was a calculated hit designed to look like an accident in midair, a cover operation, and I had almost been the face on every news broadcast in the country. Just as I stepped fully into the terminal, my phone, still in airplane mode, buzzed repeatedly the moment it reconnected to service. Texts from my mother, my sister, missed calls from unknown numbers. Then a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. I pressed play, my hands shaking. A distorted voice said, "We know you got off the plane. This is not over." That was the moment I realized I was not just a survivor. I was now involved in a battle I never asked to fight. And the people behind this weren't finished with me yet. I stood in the terminal surrounded by flashing lights, federal agents, and panicked passengers. But in that moment, every sound felt distant, as if I were underwater. The voicemail still echoed in my mind. This is not over. I could feel my hands trembling, not just from what almost happened, but from the reality that I had unknowingly stepped into something far larger than myself. A female agent approached me with a firm but compassionate expression and said I would be taken to a secure holding area away from the public. She explained that the suspects were part of a domestic extremist group that had been plotting targeted attacks disguised as aviation accidents. They had identified a specific federal whistleblower who was supposed to be traveling on this flight under a protected identity. That whistleblower had canceled at the last minute without their knowledge. My seat, the one they targeted, was originally assigned to him. That was when it hit me. I was alive not by chance, but because a woman I had never met chose to act on instinct rather than routine. If Alyssa had ignored her gut feeling, if she had shrugged off the seating change, if she had been even 1 minute too late, I would have been part of a breaking news headline, not a living person telling my story. As federal agents led me away, I passed by families hugging one another, passengers crying with relief, and people angrily demanding answers from airline staff. Their lives had been disrupted, their travel plans ruined, but in time they would understand. Those inconveniences had saved them. I was escorted to a small private room where I finally saw Alyssa again. She no longer wore the composed expression of a flight attendant. She was an undercover federal agent, and that napkin was not just a warning. It was the first step in saving hundreds of lives that day. When our eyes met, I broke down, not with fear this time, but with gratitude. She walked over and placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "I need you to know something," she said softly. "You were never supposed to be in danger, but when I saw the look in your eyes, I knew you were strong enough to hear the truth." Her words settled into my heart. All my life, I had been the one helping others, patients, families, strangers in crisis. But on that day, I had to rely on someone else to save me. Over the next several hours, I gave my statement. I learned that the teenage boy had been coerced by the extremist group and had quietly tried to signal distress by clutching his backpack. The woman in the business suit was actually an embedded agent from another branch, monitoring the suspects from a different angle. Multiple agencies had been tracking this operation for weeks. The decision to stop the flight was not random. It had been triggered the moment Alyssa slipped me that napkin, because I reacted, because I moved, because I did not ignore the warning signs. What I thought was fear became my greatest protection. What I thought was panic was actually clarity. Later that night, I was driven to a secured hotel with federal protection. I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from family and friends who had seen breaking news about a major threat prevented at LAX. My sister finally got through on a protected line, sobbing with relief. My mother's voice cracked when she heard mine. I felt the tears fall down my face as I realized how close I had come to never hearing her voice again. I expected to feel weak, traumatized, broken, but instead I felt something unexpected: purpose. If this had been my last day on Earth, I would have left without telling the world what I had seen, what I learned. That danger often hides behind normal moments, that a single warning can save your life if you are willing to listen. In the days that followed, I cooperated with authorities as they dismantled the larger network behind the attack. My story was never released to the public in full detail due to ongoing investigations, but what I went through changed the course of my life. I stopped living passively. I started paying attention, not with fear, but with awareness. I made a promise to myself that I would never again dismiss my instincts or ignore the signs others try to give. Today, I share this story because you deserve to know that sometimes your life hinges on a choice you never expected to make. You may never be handed a napkin with a warning written on it, but you might feel uneasy about a situation, notice something off, or hear a voice inside you telling you to act. Don't ignore it. Your instinct is not panic, it is protection. And sometimes, protection comes in the form of a stranger begging you to listen. If this story opened your eyes or made you feel grateful to be alive today, make sure you subscribe right now and comment where you are watching from. Your comment might remind someone else to pay attention, and that reminder could save a life.